Hey, I'm Alex, and today we're looking at how ego can turn deadly on Everest. From a Karen who ignored failing gear until it snapped, to a summit pushed too far that ended in a fatal descent. It was October 8th, 2017, on the north face of Mount Everest, nearing the second step at 28,300 feet. The pre-monsoon season was ending, and only the most experienced teams remained. Conditions were unpredictable, and every step required focus. Charlotte Hopkins, 46, a wellness influencer from Malibu, had built her brand around intuitive living and body wisdom. She had documented months of preparation for Everest, insisting her holistic approach would give her an edge. Her goal was to summit while keeping her natural lifestyle principles intact, proving her philosophy could guide her safely to the top. Looking at her preparation, I kept thinking about how confidence can be misleading. She had experience on lower peaks, but Everest is different. You can train all you want, but nothing fully prepares the body or mind for the death zone. I realized that sometimes thinking you know better than experts is exactly what gets people in trouble. Above 26,000 feet, supplemental oxygen is critical. The brain needs a constant flow to stay sharp. Even small drops in oxygen can cause confusion, poor judgment, and unsteady movement. Oxygen systems are calibrated for precise flow and conservation, and any modification can be deadly. I could tell that up there. Ignoring even small rules is like rolling dice with your life. Base Camp had warned repeatedly not to tamper with equipment. Her guide explained that modifying the mask or regulator could be fatal. Hopkins continued to complain about the mask feeling restrictive, and began adjusting it for comfort, loosening straps and changing the flow rate. At first, she reported feeling more comfortable, but in reality, she was receiving far less oxygen than indicated, and the subtle deficit began to take its toll immediately. It's crazy how easy it is to think you're fine even when your body is already in trouble. I imagine how scary that would feel. As she climbed higher, the effects of insufficient oxygen gradually impaired her coordination and decision-making. By 28,000 feet, her movements became uneven and awkward, and her speech over the radio grew slurred. Her guide observed these changes and attempted to intervene, urging her to check her oxygen system and follow proper protocols. Hopkins ignored the warnings, insisting that she could manage the climb, and that the adjustments improved her performance. The extreme altitude amplified every small error. Hopkins repeatedly removed her gloves, exposing her hands to the frigid air, where temperatures had dropped well below zero. This behavior further increased the risk of frostbite and hypothermia, both common at this elevation. Each minor choice, altering the mask, ignoring guidance, exposing herself to the cold, added cumulative strain on her body, transforming the climb into an increasingly dangerous endeavor. The compromised oxygen system continued to deteriorate as she ascended. At elevations above 28,000 feet, even a brief lapse in judgment or a minor equipment failure can become life-threatening. By 28,200 feet, the mask and regulator were no longer delivering sufficient oxygen. Hopkins collapsed suddenly, unable to maintain her balance or continue upward movement. Her guide immediately attached her to his backup system and radioed for emergency evacuation, coordinating with other team members to secure her safely for descent. Despite the rapid response, the effects of prolonged oxygen deprivation had already caused irreversible physiological damage. It really hits me that on Everest, even small mistakes repeated over time can be deadly. It makes me respect the mountain and the rules a lot more. Her brain and body had suffered from severe hypoxia over several hours. She remained unconscious throughout the descent, with her guide and support team performing all possible interventions to maintain her condition during the hazardous trip back to Camp 4. Upon arrival at Camp 4, medical personnel confirmed that she could not be revived. The coroner later determined that severe cerebral hypoxia caused by inadequate oxygen delivery was the direct cause of death. The incident prompted immediate reviews of oxygen equipment procedures and the implementation of mandatory inspections at every camp. The incident prompted new safety protocols requiring equipment inspections at every camp. The tragedy highlighted the critical importance of following established procedures, maintaining properly functioning life support equipment, and adhering to safety protocols at extreme altitude. Charlotte Hopkins' climb serves as a stark reminder that even experienced climbers can face fatal consequences if equipment is altered and fundamental rules are ignored. It was May 3, 2017, on the standard southeast ridge route of Mount Everest. Camp 3 clung to the steep Lhotse face at 24,000 feet, a collection of tents anchored to ice ledges carved into the 50-degree slope. Claudia Beverly, 49, was part of a commercial expedition and had paid for a premium package that included dedicated Sherpa support and customized services. She worked in wealth management and had completed one previous high-altitude climb on Mount Kilimanjaro, which required no technical skills or supplemental oxygen. Beverly mentioned frequently that her premium fee entitled her to personalized attention and scheduling flexibility that standard packages did not include. During the 3-week acclimatization period, Beverly requested modifications to the climbing schedule, including later departure times and extended breakfast periods with specific meal preparations requiring separate cooking. When the expedition leader explained that everyone ate the same meals at the same time for efficiency, Beverly pointed to her package's mention of customized service. The guides accommodated her requests when possible, though this required her personal Sherpa to prepare food separately. Beverly also requested longer rest stops during climbs. During the ascent from Camp 1 to Camp 2, she stopped 6 times, each time resting for 10 to 15 minutes, causing the group to arrive at Camp 2 nearly 2 hours behind the main team. When the expedition leader noted that extended delays could create problems during the summit push, Beverly maintained she was managing her energy appropriately and understood her own physical limits. On May 2nd, the expedition leader announced a weather window opening May 4th, with summit attempts departing Camp 4 around midnight. He emphasized that all climbers needed to maintain group pace for safe descent before afternoon weather deterioration. Beverly approached him privately to argue that her premium package entitled her to climb at her own pace with dedicated Sherpa support. The leader explained that no exceptions were possible above Camp 4. Beverly did not raise the issue again, but remained visibly dissatisfied. On May 3rd, the team arrived at the South Col at 2:30 p.m. with plans to depart at 11 p.m. During the rest period, Beverly made multiple requests to her Sherpa for hand warmers, specific snacks, and adjustments to her oxygen setup, each requiring equipment to be unpacked and repacked. When the guide called for departure at 10:45 p.m., Beverly emerged 15 minutes late. The team left at 11:10 p.m., already behind schedule. Beverly climbed slowly from the start, stopping frequently. The team reached the balcony at 5:20 a.m., 50 minutes behind the planned schedule. After a brief rest, the group resumed at 5:25 a.m. Beverly stood 4 minutes later and followed. At 8:50 a.m., the team reached 28,400 feet, with the summit 600 feet above. The guide radioed base camp, and the decision was made to continue with a firm 11:30 a.m. turnaround. At 9:15 a.m., Beverly sat down on the fixed line, despite instructions to maintain pace. The guide helped her to her feet after 3 minutes. The team reached the summit at 10:45 a.m. Beverly spent 8 minutes at the top, while her Sherpa photographed her. Other team members had already begun descending after 2 to 3 minutes. She started down at 10:55 a.m. Her pace slowed immediately. The 300-foot stretch between the summit and South Summit took 75 minutes, with Beverly stopping 6 times on the fixed line. By 1:40 p.m., the team was at 27,800 feet, with winds at 30 miles per hour and temperature falling to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Beverly sat down and could not continue under her own power. The guide instructed the Sherpas to short rope her, keeping a shortened length of rope between Beverly and a Sherpa to physically control her movement down the slope. At 3:50 p.m., at 27,200 feet, Beverly collapsed and could not stand even with assistance. 2 Sherpas managed to move her approximately 50 feet over 20 minutes before progress became impossible. With darkness less than 90 minutes away and the team still 1,200 feet above camp, the guide established an emergency bivouac at a small rock outcrop at 27,150 feet. At 5:10 p.m., Beverly became unresponsive. Wind gusts reached 45 miles per hour, and temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Her breathing stopped at 5:45 p.m. The guide and Sherpas descended through darkness using headlamps, reaching Camp 4 at 8:20 p.m., with frostbite injuries to their extremities. Beverly's body was recovered on May 8th when conditions improved. The investigation determined death from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, concluding that her cumulative delays, totaling roughly 2.5 hours beyond a standard ascent, placed the team in an unrecoverable position as daylight and oxygen supplies ran out simultaneously. The report noted that the Sherpas and guide who remained with Beverly sustained serious frostbite injuries as a direct consequence of the extended time spent above 27,000 feet attempting to assist her descent. It was May 18th, 2016, a cold, wind-swept morning high on the slopes of Mount Everest. Above the clouds, the mountain's upper ridges stretched into thin, unforgiving air, where climbers moved slowly under heavy gear, as a brief summit window drew teams toward the peak. Mariah Rosal, 46, stood in the lobby of a hotel in Kathmandu, reviewing expedition paperwork with the methodical attention she brought to every business transaction. She carried herself with the controlled confidence of someone used to directing outcomes, her posture straight, her tone measured as she confirmed permits, oxygen allocations, and guide assignments without hesitation. Back in Plano, Texas, she ran an image consulting business built on precision and presentation, and she approached the expedition the same way, less as an uncertain climb and more as a goal to be executed. I can't help but think how driven she must have been. I probably wouldn't be that organized if it were me. Months of planning had gone into securing their spots, shaping a narrative she intended to see through. A successful Everest summit alongside her 19-year-old daughter, Kashieka. The application forms told a carefully edited story. Mariah listed a guided climb of Mount Kilimanjaro in 2013 and a trek to Everest Base Camp the following year, supported by gym logs and photos from weekend hikes in Colorado. While Kashieka's section highlighted recreational running, her first year at university, and those same outings. The gap between casual hiking and real mountaineering went unmentioned, and Kashieka had never really shown interest in Everest until her mom made it a mother-daughter goal. I would probably be freaking out or thinking about whether I really wanted to do something like this. The expedition company accepted clients with varying experience levels if they could demonstrate basic fitness and pay the required fees, a model Mariah had researched in detail, focusing on success rates, oxygen logistics, and guide support. During the pre-trip briefing, she asked precise questions about Sherpa assistance and summit statistics, but when the possibility of turning around was raised, she treated it as routine caution rather than a likely outcome. I can't imagine being that confident in the face of warnings. I'd be second-guessing every decision, but she seemed determined to keep going no matter what. Kashieka remained mostly quiet, a 19-year-old biology student uncertain about her path, aware of the financial commitment and her mother's expectations, and understanding that backing out would create a conflict she had long learned to avoid. The trek from Lukla to base camp took 12 days, following the standard acclimatization schedule through Namche Bazaar, Tengbochi, and Dingboch. Maria documented each milestone with photos and journal entries she planned to share on social media, approaching the trek as a challenging but manageable adventure tour. From Namche Bazaar onward, Kashieka struggled with the effects of high altitude. I feel bad for her here. I know I'd be exhausted just walking a few steps at that height. She experienced headaches, nausea, fatigue, and a worsening cough. Her appetite declined, and even simple tasks like organizing gear or walking left her exhausted. She required frequent rest breaks, often stayed in her sleeping bag during rest days, and sometimes appeared mentally dulled. Despite Maria's encouragement and Sherpa support, Kashieka became increasingly vulnerable on technical terrain, needing guidance and supervision during the summit push. Base camp at 17,600 feet introduced a harsher environment. Kashieka continued to struggle with fatigue and reduced appetite, while Maria thrived on the energy of the camp, studying route maps, monitoring weather, and coordinating logistics, confident that her investments in Sherpa support and upgrades would aid their summit push. I would probably be exhausted just trying to keep up and worried about how my partner was doing. Acclimatization rotations through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,500 feet introduced technical challenges neither had practiced extensively. Kashieka moved cautiously, pausing frequently to check her clipping or catch her breath, while Maria's constant monitoring of her slowed her own progress and disrupted her rhythm. Mariah reacted to this assessment by seeking second opinions from other expedition members and researching altitude sickness symptoms online. She concluded that Kashieka was experiencing normal adjustment challenges that would resolve with more exposure to altitude. When the expedition leader suggested that Kashieka might benefit from spending an extra day at base camp before the next rotation, Maria argued that maintaining the schedule was more important than accommodating temporary discomfort. A lead climbing Sherpa named Pemba, who had been assigned to work with several expedition members, including Maria and Kashieka, expressed private concerns to the expedition leader. He had observed Kashieka's slow recovery between rotations, her difficulty with technical sections, and her apparent lack of enthusiasm for the climbing itself. It must have been stressful trying to help someone in that condition at such extreme altitude. During a team meeting at base camp, he suggested that Kashieka might want to consider stopping at the South Col if she was not moving strongly by summit night. Maria's reaction was immediate and defensive. She pointed out the money they had invested, the training they had completed, and Kashieka's determination to reach the summit with her mother. She questioned whether Pemba was being overly conservative and asked to speak with the expedition leader privately about getting more aggressive Sherpa support for the summit push. Kashieka sat quietly during this discussion, occasionally nodding when her mother made points about their preparation and commitment. The weather window for summit attempts opened in mid-May, creating pressure on all the expedition teams at base camp. Maria monitored weather forecasts obsessively and lobbied for an early position in the summit rotation. She argued that she and Kashieka were ready and that waiting would only increase the risk of missing their opportunity entirely. I can feel the pressure she must have been under, and it's easy to see how I might get caught up in the excitement and push too hard. On May 20th, the expedition moved to Camp 2 for final acclimatization. Kashieka continued to struggle, requiring assistance with her pack and longer rest breaks. She ate very little and went to bed immediately after the evening briefing. Pemba approached Maria privately that evening to discuss Kashieka's condition. He explained that the summit push would be far more demanding than anything they had done so far, with longer exposure to extreme altitude, colder temperatures, and no opportunity for extended rest. He recommended that they consider having Kashieka wait at base camp while Maria attempted the summit, or that both of them postpone their attempt until Kashieka showed stronger performance. Maria rejected both suggestions. I can't imagine being in Pemba's shoes here. I'd be freaking out if I were responsible for someone so clearly struggling. She explained that this was a mother-daughter achievement, that Kashieka was stronger than she appeared, and that they had come too far to turn back based on excessive caution. She reminded Pemba that they had paid for full expedition support and expected him to help them reach the summit safely. At Camp 3 on May 21st, Kashieka's struggles persisted. She climbed slowly, needed frequent encouragement, and had difficulty with basic tasks like gear checks and managing her oxygen equipment. Her symptoms suggested early-stage altitude illness. The expedition doctor examined Kashieka again and found her blood oxygen levels lower than ideal, but not immediately dangerous. Her mental state appeared somewhat dulled, but she could answer questions appropriately and expressed willingness to continue. The doctor recommended close monitoring and suggested that any deterioration during the summit push should result in immediate descent. I felt nervous watching her continue, knowing she was already at serious risk and needed constant monitoring. Maria interpreted this assessment as medical clearance for the summit attempt. She spent the evening at Camp 3 reviewing the summit timeline, checking equipment, and discussing logistics with Pemba. Kashieka went to bed early, complaining of fatigue and cold despite the insulated tent and sleeping system. The final move to the South Col at 26,000 feet took place on May 22nd. The South Col was a harsh, windswept plateau that served as the launching point for summit attempts. Multiple expedition teams had established camps there, creating a crowded and noisy environment. The altitude made every activity exhausting, and the constant wind stripped heat from exposed skin within minutes. Maria, by contrast, appeared energized by reaching the South Col. She reviewed the summit route repeatedly, organized her gear with meticulous attention to detail, and discussed timing and logistics with other climbers. I was struck by how different her energy was compared to Kashieka, almost like she was in a completely different world at that altitude. She took photos of the camp setup and made notes for the social media posts she planned to share after the summit. Pemba made one final attempt to discuss Kashieka's condition with Maria. He explained that the summit push would begin around 11 p.m. and require 12 to 15 hours of continuous climbing in extreme conditions. Kashieka would need to move efficiently on technical terrain, manage her oxygen equipment independently, and maintain mental clarity for navigation navigation and safety decisions. Based on her performance over the past several days, he was not confident she could meet these demands. Maria's response was firm and final. She had invested too much money, time, and emotional energy to turn back at the last moment. Kashieka was tired but determined, and with proper Sherpa support, they would both reach the summit safely. She reminded Pemba that this was their only opportunity and that she expected him to provide the assistance they had paid for. I felt a knot in my stomach, thinking about how dangerous it must have been to keep going like that. The summit push began from the South Col, with Maria, Kashieka, and Pemba joining climbers from several other expeditions. The route started on a moderate slope, but the extreme altitude made every step a struggle. Climbers moved in single file, connected to fixed ropes, with headlamps casting narrow pools of light that barely pierced the darkness. As they ascended, Kashieka's condition worsened. Her movements became slow and deliberate. Rest breaks grew longer, and she made repeated errors with her equipment. Disoriented and increasingly unable to follow instructions, she required constant supervision from Pemba. Managing both mother and daughter at the same time split Pemba's attention and slowed the group's overall progress. He tried to keep Kashieka moving at a steady pace while repeatedly reminding Maria to focus on her own climbing instead of continuously monitoring her daughter. But the strain on all three was becoming evident. I get why the group fell behind. I think I'd be panicking trying to keep track of even one person in that cold. The route above the South Col included several technical sections where climbers had to navigate steep rock steps and exposed ridges. Kashieka struggled with these obstacles, often needing verbal guidance from Pemba and physical assistance with clipping and unclipping from the fixed ropes. Her movements appeared increasingly uncoordinated, and she began making simple mistakes with her equipment. The group had fallen significantly behind the planned pace. Other expedition teams steadily passed them, and bottlenecks at the technical sections became increasingly severe. Climbers were forced to wait in the biting wind, standing exposed on narrow ridges while managing their ropes and equipment with trembling hands. The cold gnawed at their fingers and faces, making even simple adjustments laborious. Maria's frustration grew as delays mounted, and she began urging for faster progress. Despite Kashieka's obvious difficulties navigating the terrain, Kashieka struggled to maintain her balance and rhythm, pausing frequently and leaning heavily on her trekking poles. Her breathing was uneven and labored, and simple questions from Pemba seemed to take extra effort to process. She hesitated over every step, fumbling with her equipment, and her movements became increasingly uncoordinated. It was clear that the extreme altitude, exhaustion, and cold were straining her ability to focus and manage even basic climbing tasks. I can feel how terrifying it must have been to watch someone fight just to keep moving in conditions that harsh. When Pemba checked her oxygen system, he found that her mask was not sealing properly, likely due to ice forming around the regulator. Fixing it required removing her gloves in the freezing air, exposing her hands to frostbite risk. The repair process dragged on for nearly 20 minutes, leaving Kashieka visibly weaker, disoriented, and struggling to regain her footing as she continued up the ridge. Maria watched this repair process with growing anxiety. She calculated that they were now several hours behind schedule and that their oxygen supplies were being depleted faster than planned. When Pemba suggested that they should turn around immediately while descent was still manageable, Maria argued that they had come too far to quit and that Kashieka just needed more time to recover. The traffic jam above the balcony proved worse than expected. Multiple expedition teams were stacked up on the fixed ropes, creating delays of 30 to 45 minutes at each bottleneck. Climbers stood exposed to the wind and cold while waiting their turn, burning oxygen and losing body heat without making progress. I can see how impossible it must have been to make progress while standing exposed to the wind and cold, losing oxygen with every minute. Pemba urgently urged Maria and Kashieka to turn back, warning that Kashieka's deteriorating condition and their delayed schedule made a safe summit impossible. Maria refused, insisting they were close and could finish with Sherpa support, citing their investment and commitment. Kashieka, following her mother's lead, showed little awareness of her own condition, responding slowly and inappropriately at times. By dawn, she was moving painfully slowly, requiring constant supervision and creating delays that endangered the group. Maria, worn down by the altitude, stress, and relentless physical exertion, began struggling to manage her own movements and equipment. I feel so helpless just imagining being there. I don't know how anyone could save them in that moment. On the exposed southeast ridge, Kashieka suddenly collapsed onto the fixed rope, her oxygen mask dislodged and her breathing shallow and irregular. Pemba was left in a dire situation, facing the near impossible task of trying to stabilize and rescue her on the steep, unforgiving terrain. Pemba and several other climbers attempted to assist Kashieka, checking her oxygen flow, repositioning her mask, and trying to encourage her to move. She responded minimally to their efforts, efforts and seemed unable to coordinate her movements effectively. Her condition suggested severe altitude illness, hypoxia, or complete exhaustion. Maria tried to assist Kashieka, but the altitude, cold, and exhaustion quickly overwhelmed her. Her movements grew unsteady, and she struggled to grasp the urgency of Pemba's instructions to begin immediate descent. I can only imagine how impossible it must have been to think clearly and act fast in conditions like that. Lowering Kashieka down the ridge in stages proved slow and dangerous, and the stress of watching her daughter collapse further drained Maria. Within minutes, she too collapsed roughly 200 feet below Kashieka, unable to continue or manage her own equipment, leaving both women incapacitated on the exposed ridge. The location of both collapses, at approximately 27,500 feet on technical terrain, made rescue extremely difficult. The altitude prevented helicopter evacuation, and the steep exposed route made it nearly impossible to carry incapacitated climbers. Pemba and other expedition members faced the reality that they could not save both Maria and Kashieka while ensuring their own survival. The decision to leave both women on the mountain was made based on the fundamental limitations of high-altitude rescue. Multiple climbers and Sherpa staff confirmed that neither Maria nor Kashieka was responsive to revival attempts, that moving them would require resources that could endanger the entire rescue team, and that the weather and daylight conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The expedition reported both climbers overdue when they failed to return to the South Col within the expected time frame. Climbers descending later that day confirmed the locations of both bodies on the southeast ridge. Recovery operations were delayed by altitude, weather conditions, and the extreme danger to recovery teams working above 27,000 feet. The subsequent investigation, based on statements from Pemba, other expedition members, and nearby climbers, established a consistent timeline of events. Both Maria and Kashieka died from complications related to extreme altitude exposure, including severe altitude illness, oxygen deprivation, exhaustion, and cold exposure. It's kind of depressing, but I guess this really shows how dangerous Everest is. I never thought about it being this brutal before. The deaths resulted from a series of decisions to continue climbing despite deteriorating conditions and missed opportunities for safe descent, rather than from any single equipment failure or natural disaster. Looking back, it's clear that Maria's decisions drove the outcome. She pushed her daughter beyond what was safe, ignored warnings, and prioritized reaching the summit over their well-being. The tragedy was preventable, and it came down to her choices, not just the mountain or bad luck. It was June 8, 2014, on the upper glacier route of Mount Everest above the high camps. At approximately 14,200 feet, a climber was moving along a heavily traveled summit corridor known for thin air, crevasse exposure, and rapidly changing Himalayan weather. What began as a summit attempt soon turned into a medical emergency in the death zone. Penelope Love was 38, a fitness trainer from Seattle who believed physical conditioning could overcome high-altitude limitations. She had completed several lower elevation climbs in the Pacific Northwest, including Mount Baker and Mount Hood, but had never climbed above 11,000 feet before attempting Everest. Acquaintances described her as highly confident in endurance training, but dismissive of high-altitude physiology. She reportedly referred to altitude sickness as a mind-over-body problem rather than a medical condition. Her objective was to reach the summit in 3 days instead of following the recommended multi-day acclimatization schedule commonly used on Everest. The route required an ascent of roughly 9,000 feet from base areas to the upper mountain zones, where atmospheric oxygen levels dropped to nearly half of sea level concentration. Above 10,000 feet, rapid ascent can trigger high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition caused by fluid accumulation and swelling inside brain tissue under oxygen deprivation. Climbing guides stationed at a mid-mountain camp observed Love developing early symptoms of altitude illness. Reports indicated she complained of persistent headache and nausea, but continued climbing after taking repeated doses of over-the-counter pain medication. Guides advised spending an additional day acclimatizing before moving higher, but she declined, stating she felt physically strong enough to continue. Other climbers moving along the same route later reported seeing Love walking unsteadily across exposed glacier sections. Witnesses described moments of slowed reaction time, occasional confusion, and difficulty maintaining stable balance on uneven ice. Her climbing partner attempted to encourage descent after noticing behavioral changes consistent with altitude impairment, But Love insisted that fatigue was the only issue. Near the final approach zone toward the upper summit corridor, Love suddenly collapsed and began vomiting repeatedly. Her partner attempted to assist her toward lower elevation, but neurological symptoms worsened quickly. Observed behavior was consistent with severe high-altitude cerebral edema, including disorientation, agitation, and loss of coordination. Shortly afterward, she lost consciousness. Emergency descent procedures were initiated by her partner, who attempted basic life support while moving downhill. During the descent, Love experienced seizure-like muscle contractions as brain swelling likely increased intracranial pressure. Her breathing became irregular and eventually stopped despite continued resuscitation attempts. The time between collapse and cardiopulmonary failure was estimated at roughly 2 hours. Terrain difficulty, extreme altitude, and physical exhaustion limited emergency response effectiveness. Helicopter evacuation was attempted, but thin air density, strong winds, and mountain topography prevented aircraft access to the high elevation zone. Ground rescue personnel reached the location after conditions stabilized. Love was pronounced dead at approximately 13,800 feet elevation. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be high-altitude cerebral edema, with brain swelling causing respiratory failure. Post-mortem analysis confirmed advanced HACE progression, and investigators noted that early warning symptoms such as headache, vomiting, irritability, and coordination loss were present but were not acted upon. The case became part of mountaineering safety education materials, reinforcing that physical fitness cannot prevent altitude-related medical failure. In the Everest death zone, the human body operates near physiological limits regardless of training level. As Penelope Love's accident demonstrated the speed at which altitude sickness can progress, another climber in a distant mountain range was approaching a summit zone where environmental hazards would soon test the boundary between endurance and survival. It was September 3, 2014, at Everest Base Camp during the late monsoon transition. Afternoon clouds formed rapidly over the upper ridges, and lightning had been observed across nearby peaks in recent days. Route managers warned that exposed sections above the South Col offered no shelter, advising climbers to descend promptly if storm conditions developed. Skylar Pemberton, 26, was a Denver-based social media consultant who had built her online presence around dramatic outdoor content. Her Everest experience consisted of guided rotations in stable weather, where decisions about pacing and safety had been handled by professionals. She framed risk as proof of character, often dismissing caution as weakness, and viewed unpredictable conditions as opportunities to capture compelling footage rather than as hazards requiring restraint. Her stated objective was to live-stream summit content in marginal weather, to distinguish herself from other climbers documenting clear sky ascents. Guides emphasized that lightning above treeline presented uncontrollable danger, and that no equipment could mitigate a direct strike. Pemberton argued that forecasts were exaggerated and insisted on continuing upward despite visible storm formation over nearby ridgelines. By late morning, clouds thickened above the upper slopes. Distant thunder rolled across the mountain, and static electricity began affecting exposed metal equipment. Other climbers began descending in accordance with established safety windows, but Pemberton continued toward the summit, pausing repeatedly to record video commentary about pushing limits in real conditions. Near the summit ridge, electrical activity intensified rapidly. The air carried a metallic odor, and fine hairs on her arms and neck lifted as static built in the charged atmosphere. Faint crackling sounds came from exposed metal along the route, and small blue sparks briefly flickered at the tips of trekking poles nearby. Thunder echoed across surrounding peaks as the storm cell moved directly overhead, reducing visibility in shifting gray cloud. Rather than descending, she stopped on the exposed ridge and positioned her phone on a rock outcrop to capture timed footage against the darkening sky. She adjusted her stance several times to frame the shot, standing fully upright on open ground with no terrain features capable of offering protection. Carabiners on her pack, a metal phone case, and trekking poles in her hands increased conductivity, making her one of the highest points on the ridge. A lightning strike hit the summit area seconds later. The discharge traveled across the rock as ground current, passing through her body via the metal equipment she was holding. The electrical surge disrupted cardiac rhythm instantly, and caused deep burns at contact points along her hands and feet. The shock also triggered violent muscle contraction, locking her body rigid before throwing her off balance. She was thrown several feet across uneven stone, striking her shoulder and head against exposed rock. Her phone shattered on impact, and loose equipment scattered across the ridge. She collapsed where she landed, unresponsive, as heavy rain and additional lightning moved across the summit, leaving her fully exposed to the continuing storm. A second strike followed shortly after, striking the same exposed zone as thunder echoed across the ridge. When storm intensity lessened, descending climbers returned cautiously to the summit area and found her unresponsive. Emergency response from lower camps was delayed until lightning activity fully subsided, as rescuers could not enter the exposed zone during active electrical discharge. Medical assessment later confirmed death due to cardiac arrest from lightning strike, with extensive electrical burns and impact injuries documented. Expedition leadership reinforced strict turnaround times during unstable weather and reiterated that exposed high-altitude terrain provides no defense against electrical storms. The incident was recorded as a weather-related fatality, resulting from continued ascent despite clear warning signs. It was May 20th, 2017, and the south col of Mount Everest lay frozen beneath the night sky at 26,000 feet above sea level. Temperatures hovered near -15 degrees Fahrenheit as steady winds swept across the exposed, wind-scoured saddle between Everest and Lhotse. The summit push into the death zone had begun under cold, dark, and heavily wind-scoured conditions. Gianni Mondero, 29, was an ICU nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, accustomed to long shifts in the cardiac unit where careful monitoring and precise decisions could determine a patient's outcome. Roji Ong, 34, was a civil engineer from Boise who designed water treatment facilities and approached climbing with the same analytical mindset he used in his work, keeping detailed gear lists and route plans throughout the expedition. The two had met 3 years earlier during a mountaineer's training course on Mount Rainier, and later climbed Aconcagua together in 2015, gaining the high-altitude experience that eventually led them to attempt Everest. Their decision to climb the world's highest mountain developed gradually from shared goals and financial planning. The expedition cost could be covered using their combined savings if their wedding reception was postponed. Roji's engineering leave was limited to 6 weeks, while Gianni arranged coverage for her ICU shifts through the end of May. The narrow schedule meant they could not wait for ideal weather or reschedule the expedition. Outside the tent, headlamps moved slowly across darkness as other teams prepared for their summit attempts. Forecast models predicted a short high-pressure weather window of roughly 36 hours before the next western storm system arrived. South Col temperatures were expected to remain near -15 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping lower on the upper mountain, while wind speeds could reach 50 miles per hour in gusts. Roji's radio crackled intermittently with weather updates and team communications, but the battery indicator showed only 2 remaining bars. The device had been used extensively during the previous week for coordination with base camp and Sherpa guide Pemba, who had successfully summited Everest 6 times. The radio served as their primary link to other expedition members on the mountain. They emerged from their tent into air so cold it seemed to crystallize in their lungs. Roji's breathing was labored, each exhalation forming a cloud of vapor that froze instantly on his balaclava. He adjusted his oxygen mask, checking the seal around his nose and mouth. The regulator showed a flow rate of 2 liters per minute, conservative for the death zone, but necessary to preserve their limited supply. Gianni moved with fluid efficiency, her movements economical and precise. She had tested higher on the altitude tolerance assessments at base camp, her oxygen saturation remaining stable even during the acclimatization rotations to camps 2 and 3. Her aerobic capacity, honed through years of trail running in the Cascade Mountains, served her well in the thin air above 20,000 feet. The fixed rope stretched upward into darkness, a highway of kernmantle cord anchored to the mountain, with ice screws and snow pickets. Other climbers were already clipped in and moving, their headlamps creating a string of lights that disappeared into the night. Roji and Gianni joined the procession, their ascenders sliding along the rope with metallic clicks that echoed off the surrounding ice. The initial pitch from Camp 4 was deceptively gentle, a gradual rise across wind-packed snow that allowed them to establish a rhythm. Roji's pace was deliberate, each step calculated to minimize energy expenditure. His boots, new overboots fitted just before the expedition, had developed a small hot spot on his left heel during the climb to Camp 4. The discomfort was manageable, but required attention to his foot placement. Gianni climbed behind him, monitoring his movement and breathing. She noticed that his rest stops were becoming more frequent. Brief pauses where he would lean forward on his ice axe and take several deep breaths. His oxygen saturation at base camp had consistently run 5 to 7 percentage points lower than hers, a difference their expedition doctor had noted but deemed acceptable for the climb. As they gained elevation, the terrain steepened and the fixed ropes became more critical for safety. The route wound through a maze of seracs and crevasses, following the path of least resistance toward the balcony at 27,500 feet. Wind gusts buffeted them intermittently, strong enough to require a firm grip on the rope and careful foot placement on the icy surface. They reached a narrow bottleneck where the route squeezed between two ice formations, forming a line of climbers waiting to pass. Roji increased his oxygen flow to 2.5 liters per minute to ease the growing heaviness in his chest, accepting the faster consumption rate, while Gianni kept hers at 2 liters per minute to conserve supply for the descent. Ahead, they arrived at the crowded balcony cache site, where expedition teams were exchanging oxygen bottles and resting under chaotic headlamp light scattered across windblown snow and gear. Roji's oxygen bottle gauge showed approximately 1/3 remaining, consistent with their planned consumption rate to this point. He located a bottle marked with their expedition's distinctive paint code, 3 blue stripes on an orange background, and began the process of switching regulators. The metal fittings were cold enough to stick to bare skin, requiring careful manipulation with insulated gloves. Gianni changed the batteries in her headlamp, a precautionary measure that would ensure reliable illumination for the remainder of the climb. She also checked their emergency supplies, spare gloves, hand warmers, energy gels, and a basic first aid kit. Everything was accounted for and accessible. The bottle Roji selected felt appropriately heavy in his hands, suggesting a full or nearly full supply of oxygen. He connected his regulator and tested the flow, feeling the familiar rush of supplemental gas through his mask. The relief was immediate. His breathing became less labored, and his vision seemed to sharpen in the thin air. Above the balcony, the route became more technical and exposed, with fixed ropes crossing steep snow slopes and rocky outcrops that required careful footing and balance. Winds strengthened with elevation, making communication difficult, so Roji and Gianni relied on hand signals and rope tugs to coordinate movement. Progress slowed on narrow ledge sections as climbers waited their turn to pass, while the cold deepened through their insulation, forcing constant small movements to maintain circulation. Roji's cough became more frequent as they climbed, a harsh sound he tried to suppress because it could signal worsening high-altitude illness, and Gianni continued monitoring his breathing during brief rests. At elevations above 25,000 feet, the thin air placed extreme strain on the body, requiring deliberate movement and reliance on supplemental oxygen. Later, they reached another supply cache marked by prayer flags and scattered empty oxygen bottles, where Roji rested briefly on a snow-covered rock and cleared frost from his mask's exhalation port before continuing. Gianni used the break to assess their progress and remaining supplies. They were moving slower than their optimistic timeline, but faster than their conservative estimates. Roji's oxygen consumption had increased with the higher flow rate, but they still had sufficient supply to reach the summit and return to the balcony for a bottle change. The critical factor would be maintaining their current pace without further deterioration in Roji's condition. The route above the cache area led through a series of steep pitches and exposed ridges. The fixed ropes were essential for safety, providing both physical support and psychological reassurance in the intimidating terrain. Other climbers moved like ghosts in the darkness, their headlamps creating brief moments of illumination before disappearing into the night. The eastern horizon began to brighten as dawn approached, though temperatures remained brutally cold. Roji's movements became more purposeful with daylight, and his rest stops grew shorter as they continued toward the south summit, a false peak marking the final technical section before the true summit. The route followed fixed ropes across steep snow and rocky terrain, where navigation without support would be dangerous, while stronger winds made progress increasingly difficult. Near the base of the final pitch, climbers encountered a slow-moving bottleneck on technical ground, forcing frequent pauses as Roji managed his breathing and adjusted his equipment despite clear signs of physical deterioration. His glove liners had become damp with perspiration and condensation, reducing their insulating properties and increasing the risk of frostbite. He flexed his fingers frequently, trying to maintain circulation and dexterity. The simple act of operating his ascender on the fixed rope required conscious effort and careful coordination. Gianni noticed that Roji's movements were becoming less coordinated, his foot placement less precise. He would occasionally stumble on uneven terrain, catching himself with his ice axe or the fixed rope. These were subtle signs of altitude-related impairment, the kind of deterioration that could progress rapidly in the death zone. They reached the south summit at 28,500 feet, where expansive views stretched across surrounding peaks, though the moment carried little celebration because the knife-edge ridge to the true summit still lay ahead. Multiple expedition teams were waiting to traverse the final ridge, creating a long, slow queue on technical terrain. Roji sat on a snow-covered rock, breathing heavily, even with supplemental oxygen, while Pemba checked his oxygen gauge and found the supply appearing lower than expected for their planned timeline. The possibility remained that the bottle was not fully filled, the gauge was inaccurate, or moisture contamination affected flow. Gianni's oxygen consumption remained stable, allowing her to continue, but Roji faced a riskier situation as the true summit stood less than 500 vertical feet above them. With their turnaround deadline approaching later in the day, they had to choose between pushing upward with limited reserves or beginning descent preparations if bottlenecks persisted. Roji struggled to his feet, swaying slightly as he adjusted his pack and checked his equipment. His mask had accumulated a significant amount of frost around the exhalation port, requiring careful clearing to maintain proper airflow. The simple task seemed to exhaust him, and he sat back down heavily. Pemba assessed the situation with the experienced eye of someone who had guided dozens of climbers through similar crises. He checked Roji's harness and safety systems, ensuring everything was properly secured. The decision to continue or retreat would ultimately rest with Roji and Gianni, but Pemba's recommendation would carry significant weight. The wind picked up as they deliberated, gusting to perhaps 40 miles per hour and creating a wind chill that penetrated even their expedition-grade insulation. Other climbers in the queue were making similar calculations, weighing the risks of continuing against the disappointment of turning back so close to their goal. Roji made the decision to continue. His oxygen supply was lower than planned, but he believed it was sufficient to reach the summit and return to the balcony where they had cached additional bottles. The risk was manageable, he reasoned, and the opportunity might not come again. They joined the queue for the final ridge, clipping into the fixed ropes that led across the knife-edge terrain toward the summit. The exposure was extreme, thousands of feet of empty air on both sides of the narrow ridge. Each step required complete focus and precise foot placement on the wind-packed snow. The line moved slowly, with frequent stops as climbers navigated the technical sections. During the waits, the cold became penetrating, seeping through their insulation and requiring constant movement to maintain circulation. Roji's cough became more frequent and productive, a harsh sound that carried clearly in the thin air. At 10:30 a.m., they reached the Hillary Step, a near vertical rock face that represented the final technical obstacle before the summit. The fixed ropes led directly up the cliff, requiring climbers to use both hands and feet to ascend the challenging terrain. A significant bottleneck had formed as each person carefully worked through the moves. Roji's coordination was clearly deteriorating by this point. His movements were less fluid, his balance less certain. He would pause frequently to catch his breath, leaning heavily on his ice axe or the fixed rope. The simple act of clipping and unclipping his ascender required conscious effort and careful attention. Gianni climbed directly behind him, ready to provide assistance if needed. She could see the signs of altitude-related impairment becoming more pronounced. The slight tremor in his hands, the way he would occasionally lose his balance on level terrain, the increasing frequency of his rest stops. They finally cleared the Hillary Step and began the final approach to the summit. The terrain was less technical, but still required careful attention to route finding and safety. The summit pyramid rose ahead of them, a wind-scoured dome of snow and ice that represented the highest point on Earth. Roji's pace had slowed significantly by this point. Each step seemed to require enormous effort, and his rest stops were becoming longer and more frequent. His oxygen gauge showed critically low levels, but the summit was now within reach, perhaps 30 minutes of climbing time under normal conditions. They reached the summit of Mount Everest, a small and crowded platform marked by prayer flags and remnants left by previous expeditions. The view was striking, but felt subdued after the intense physical and mental effort required to arrive there. Roji sat heavily in the snow, breathing with difficulty even while using supplemental oxygen, and Gianni grew concerned about his ability to descend safely. They took the required summit photographs, but the moment carried little celebration because the descent would be the most dangerous part of the climb. They soon began moving downward along the knife-edge ridge, where Roji's condition continued to worsen with increasing imbalance, slower movements, and declining coordination on the technical terrain. At the Hillary step, the descent proved even more challenging than the ascent. The exposure was intimidating, and the need to face outward while rappelling required precise technique and steady nerves. Roji struggled with the rope work, his movements slow and deliberate as he fought against the effects of altitude and exhaustion. The queue for the descent was as congested as it had been for the ascent, with climbers moving slowly through the technical sections. During the waits, Roji would sit heavily in the snow, his head hanging forward as he struggled to catch his breath. His oxygen supply was now critically low, with perhaps 30 minutes of flow remaining at his current consumption rate. They reached the south summit and began the traverse toward the main descent route, moving along a narrow, exposed ridge with steep drops on both sides. While the fixed ropes provided some security, the terrain demanded constant focus and precise foot placement. Roji's foot caught on a wind-sculpted patch of hard snow, causing him to stumble forward before catching himself with his ice axe, a clear sign that his coordination and balance were deteriorating. Gianni moved closer in case immediate assistance was needed. The traverse continued across technical ground with rocky outcrops and steep snow slopes, but Roji's pace had slowed significantly, each step requiring great effort and longer rests. His oxygen supply eventually ran out, and the sudden loss of supplemental gas made his breathing more labored, while his movements became slower and increasingly uncoordinated as they remained several hundred feet above the balcony cache. Pemba assessed the situation and made a critical decision. He would descend quickly to the balcony with Gianni to retrieve a fresh oxygen bottle, while Roji remained clipped to the fixed rope at a secure anchor point. The plan was risky, leaving Roji alone at altitude while his condition deteriorated, but it offered the best chance of getting him the oxygen he needed to continue the descent safely. Roji was secured to a solid anchor with multiple slings and carabiners, his position protected from the wind by a small rock outcrop. He was conscious and responsive, but clearly struggling with the effects of oxygen deprivation. His speech was slurred, and his movements were slow and deliberate. Gianni and Pemba began their descent toward the balcony, moving as quickly as safety would allow on the technical terrain. The cached bottles were approximately 45 minutes away under normal conditions, but they pushed the pace despite the risks involved in rapid movement at altitude. The balcony cache site was in chaos when they arrived. Multiple expedition teams had accessed their supplies throughout the day, and bottles were scattered across the area. Some were clearly empty, others were partially used, and a few appeared to be full. The identification markings were partially obscured by wind-blown snow and frost. Gianni and Pemba searched through the scattered bottles, looking for one with their expedition's distinctive paint markings. They found several candidates, but the weight test, lifting each bottle to assess its contents, revealed that some were not as full as expected. The labeling system had broken down in the chaos of Summit Day, with bottles from different teams becoming mixed together. After several minutes of searching, they located a bottle that felt appropriately heavy and bore markings that suggested it was from their cache. The regulator connection was clean, and the gauge showed full pressure. It appeared to be exactly what Roji needed to continue his descent safely. The return climb to Roji's position took longer than expected. The technical terrain required careful movement, and both Gianni and Pemba were feeling the effects of their rapid descent and reascent. The additional weight of the oxygen bottle made the climbing more challenging, but they pushed forward with growing urgency. When they reached the anchor point where Roji had been secured, he was no longer there. The slings and carabiners remained clipped to the fixed rope, but Roji was gone. Scuff marks in the snow suggested movement downslope, and a single glove lay partially buried several yards below the anchor point. The fixed rope showed fresh abrasion marks where it passed over a sharp rock edge, and the angle of the terrain suggested that Roji had somehow become unclipped from his anchor and slid down the steep face below the traverse. The distance was significant, perhaps several hundred feet of steep rocky terrain that would be impossible to survive. Gianni called out Roji's name, her voice carrying across the wind-scoured landscape. There was no response. Pemba used his radio to contact other teams in the area, asking if anyone had seen Roji or could assist with a search. The responses were negative. No one had observed him moving from the anchor point. The terrain below the traverse was too steep and technical for an immediate rescue attempt. The risk of additional accidents was too high, and the approaching afternoon weather made conditions increasingly dangerous. Other climbers descending past the area reported seeing a motionless figure behind a rock formation several hundred feet below, but the location was inaccessible without specialized rescue equipment. Search and recovery operations along the South Summit Traverse were suspended due to extreme exposure, high winds, and the high probability of secondary accidents to rescue personnel. Climbers descending past the area later confirmed the presence of a motionless figure below the traverse, but the terrain remained too steep and technical for immediate access. Expedition leaders determined that recovery efforts would have to wait for a period of stable weather and specialized high-altitude support. 2 days later, when conditions improved, Sherpa workers reached the location and confirmed Roji's death. The body was carefully relocated to a more accessible slope before being transported to Camp 2, where a helicopter long-line operation later carried it to Kathmandu for medical examination. Pathologists documented cerebral and pulmonary edema consistent with severe altitude illness, compounded by hypothermia. External examination also noted frostbite injuries to the fingers and nose, minor abrasions along the torso, consistent with a sliding descent, and pressure marks associated with climbing harness straps. Investigation reports concluded that multiple factors may have contributed to the fatal descent failure. Testing of Roji's oxygen regulator showed internal icing that could have restricted gas flow, while the cylinder he switched to at the balcony cache was measured as underfilled despite its pressure reading. Inventory records suggested that oxygen bottles from different expedition teams became mixed during the crowded summit day, and at least one depleted cylinder may have been mistakenly returned upright to the cache before Roji selected it. Authorities later stated that recovery of the body from the steep rock face was not feasible using standard high-altitude rescue methods. Gianni and Pemba descended to Camp 4 later that day with other climbers, carrying the unused oxygen bottle back into expedition storage. Weather conditions deteriorated as predicted the following evening, confirming the narrowness of the climbing window. Roji's death was officially recorded as resulting from high-altitude illness and a fall during technical descent along the South Summit Traverse. It was May 22, 2016, in the infamous death zone above 26,000 feet on Mount Everest. Climbers moved slowly through the Hillary Step, a nearly vertical 40-foot rock face where fixed ropes guide, passage across narrow, exposed ledges. At that altitude, every minute burns precious oxygen, and a single misstep can be fatal. Yachi Timsinya, 38, a corporate lawyer from Chicago, approached the climb with the same intensity she brought to the courtroom. She had summited Denali and Aconcagua, and Everest was meant to be her ultimate achievement. I noticed from the start that she treated the mountain as a contest rather than a challenge that required careful adjustment. Her focus on personal accomplishment and being first in line drove her decisions more than judgment or experience. The Hillary Step is one of the deadliest bottlenecks on the mountain. Climbers must ascend single file, yielding to descending teams, and carefully coordinate movements. Even small delays burn precious oxygen, and every minute spent stationary increases the risk of altitude sickness. At this altitude, cognitive function deteriorates and reaction time slows. Mistakes that might be minor lower down can be fatal here. I noticed how every climber around her was operating on a razor's edge, and any disruption would ripple across the group. Timsina quickly became frustrated when she found herself behind a slower-moving team. It felt like impatience rather than concern for safety guided her actions. She demanded the team move faster, disregarding the fact that the ledges were too narrow to pass safely. Her competitive nature seemed to cloud judgment, and it became clear that she prioritized her ego over established protocols. Watching her from a distance, it felt like she was blind to the danger her own behavior was creating, as if the mountain existed only to serve her ambitions. At a critical point, halfway up the Hillary step, she attempted to climb around the slower climbers. She detached from her safety line to reposition herself, a decision that struck me as reckless even before the fall. Every choice requires full attention and respect for the environment, and any deviation can have fatal consequences. The other climbers were visibly tense, aware that a misstep could end in disaster for anyone nearby. A sudden gust of wind struck as she transferred her weight. Without the safety line attached, she lost balance and fell backward. Her body tumbled down the rock face, striking jagged outcroppings before disappearing from view. I saw how impossible not to recognize her insistence on moving ahead. Ignoring advice and believing she could bend the mountain to her will led to this moment. Rescue teams located her body 3 days later, roughly 800 feet below the Hillary step. The coroner ruled massive trauma as the cause of death, with contributing factors of altitude sickness and impaired judgment. Her oxygen tank was nearly full, showing that she had been adequately prepared and equipped. Her death was not a lack of resources, but a result of decisions made in defiance of experience and caution. The incident made climbing journals and forums note the dangers of ignoring protocols, and the climbers who witnessed her fall emphasized patience and teamwork as essential for survival. Tim Cena's law firm issued a brief statement about her adventurous spirit and declined further comment. The German climber she tried to bypass completed his summit and later started a foundation focused on mountain safety. Watching all of this unfold, I realized how dangerous ego can be. In her office, being pushy and competitive might get results, but up there, above 26,000 feet, it just made things worse. Every step needed caution, teamwork, and paying attention to the mountain. Even with gear, training, and experience, ignoring simple safety rules can quickly turn deadly. Her choices highlight the consequences of prioritizing personal ambition over collective safety. The mountain does not negotiate or bend to desire. Tim Cena's competitive instincts, impatience, and belief that rules could be bypassed ultimately prove fatal. It is a sobering reminder that on Everest, survival depends on discipline and situational awareness, and even the most confident individual can be undone by the environment when ego takes the lead. It was April 19th, 2015, in the Khumbu region of Nepal. Base camp sat at 17,600 feet on the Khumbu Glacier, a sprawling collection of colorful tents scattered across the moraine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as climbers moved between expedition camps. Dr. Bonnie Baxter, 47, arrived as part of a commercial expedition of 12 climbers. She had completed 3 high-altitude treks, but Everest was her first technical climb above 24,000 feet. Baxter worked as an emergency room physician and made frequent references to her medical background when questioned about protocols. During the initial safety briefing, she interrupted the lead guide several times to suggest alternative approaches to altitude sickness management. During acclimatization rotations, Baxter questioned the oxygen flow rates recommended by the expedition outfitter. She adjusted her regulator settings based on her own calculations, insisting her medical training gave her better judgment. When a Sherpa pointed out her tank was depleting faster than expected, she dismissed the observation. At Camp 2, Baxter purchased an additional oxygen canister from a climber leaving early due to illness. She stored all 3 bottles in her personal tent, rather than registering the extra with expedition inventory. When her tent partner, Margaret Rosen, began showing signs of altitude sickness and asked if Baxter had oxygen to spare, Baxter said she needed every bottle for her own summit attempt. The expedition leader arranged for Rosen to receive oxygen from reserve stock and descend with a Sherpa. Baxter remarked that the climber had simply not prepared adequately for the mountain. Rosen recovered at base camp over 2 days and rejoined the expedition at Camp 4 after the team's scheduled rest day, cleared by the expedition medic to continue. Before the summit push, the expedition leader conducted mandatory equipment checks at Camp 4. When he examined Baxter's 3rd bottle, he noted visible wear on one of the regulator valves and recommended she leave it behind. Baxter stated her medical background made her qualified to evaluate the equipment herself and refused to leave it, citing taking ownership of the bottle. The team departed at 11 p.m. Baxter carried 3 oxygen canisters strapped to her pack, approximately 8 pounds more than other climbers carried. At 27,500 feet, Rosen struggled with her breathing and fell behind, descending with a Sherpa support climber. At 28,200 feet, roughly 700 feet below the summit, Baxter began falling behind as well, stopping 3 times within a 20-minute span. The lead guide assigned a Sherpa to stay with her and continued upward with the remaining clients. At 6:40 a.m., while the Sherpa was briefly occupied assisting another climber, Baxter unclipped from the fixed rope and moved laterally across a 40-degree snow slope. A descending climber spotted her approximately 60 feet off the established route, moving slowly without clear direction, and was unable to get her attention. She continued traversing until the slope steepened to near vertical rock, then sat down in the snow, her oxygen mask hanging loose around her neck. When the descending climber reached her, 2 of her 3 bottles were empty. The third, still full, had rolled 10 feet down slope and lodged against a rock. One empty regulator showed a crack at the connection valve, the same valve the expedition leader had flagged. The climber retrieved the full bottle and attempted to connect it to her mask, but Baxter did not respond to verbal prompts or physical touch. Her eyes were open but unfocused. The climber radioed the situation at 7:10 a.m. The lead guide was at the summit and could not descend immediately due to traffic on the fixed lines. The descending climber stayed with Baxter for 20 minutes, attempting to administer oxygen and warm her hands. Her breathing became irregular and shallow. At 7:35 a.m., she slumped forward. He checked for a pulse and found none. Due to his own depleting oxygen, he marked the GPS location and continued his descent. A recovery team reached Baxter's position the following morning. Her body remained in the same seated position, 65 feet from the fixed line. The full oxygen bottle was still lodged against the rock. The official investigation determined the cause of death as severe hypoxia, leading to high-altitude cerebral edema. The faulty valve, identified during the equipment check and ignored, caused her first bottle to deplete rapidly early in the summit push. Her self-adjusted flow rates had compounded the deficit over hours. By the time she switched to her second bottle, cognitive impairment was already advanced. The wandering from the route and inability to retrieve the full bottle beside her were consistent with late-stage edema. Baxter's body was brought down the mountain over 6 days by a specialized recovery team. It was September 14th, 2015, at a high camp zone on Mount Everest's West Ridge approach, where sustained winds carried spindrift across exposed slopes and sub-zero air moved through layered expedition tents. The upper mountain was obscured by ground blizzard conditions, and most climbing teams reinforced camp structures while waiting for a safer weather window. Charlie Rayos was a 34-year-old corporate attorney from Denver who had taken up mountaineering 3 years earlier. She had built confidence on lower mountain climbs in Colorado, and one guided ascent above 15,000 feet. But she had never spent prolonged time above 17,000 feet, traveled solo across glacier terrain, or navigated whiteout conditions independently. Rayos declined expedition guide services for Everest's upper mountain, describing turnaround delays and weather holds as unnecessary caution rather than essential safety measures, and questioned delayed summit schedules and described rest windows as wasted opportunity. She expressed strong confidence that physical conditioning and equipment preparation would compensate for worsening environmental conditions. Above 17,000 feet on Everest, the route narrows into an exposed ridge bordered by steep drop zones and crevasse fields. Oxygen concentration is roughly half of sea level, impairing judgment and slowing reaction time. The route depends on marker wands identifying the safest traversal line. During whiteout conditions, those markers can be buried under drifting snow, removing reliable visual orientation. On the morning of September 14th, a high wind advisory was issued for the upper mountain. Most teams remained inside camp. Shortly after sunrise, Rayos left alone, leaving a note stating she was going for it regardless. She advanced toward the summit ridge without a rope team, while visibility was near zero. Navigation data later showed that by mid-morning, she had drifted significantly away from the established route. Track patterns suggested disorientation, with repeated course corrections consistent with whiteout confusion. With sky and ground blending into a uniform gray field, loss of horizon reference likely accelerated navigational error under hypoxic stress. Spindrift snow gradually filled shallow depressions along the glacier surface, obscuring crevasse boundaries and softening visual texture across the route. Investigators later determined that Rios likely traversed what appeared to be a gently sloping surface while attempting to return to the established summit corridor. However, the path she entered was the upper entrance of a steep couloir that diverged from the main climbing line. The channel consisted of wind-compacted blue ice hidden beneath a thin layer of loose powder snow, terminating abruptly at a vertical cliff band below. Footprints near the rollover point indicated a brief pause before she committed weight onto the descending slope. Within several steps, the underlying ice surface provided insufficient traction, causing her crampons to lose secure contact with the ground. An ice axe was later recovered embedded downslope, showing scoring marks consistent with at least one controlled attempt to arrest the fall. However, the combination of hardened ice, steep gradient, and altitude-related motor impairment significantly reduced friction and mechanical stopping capability. As momentum increased, she slid uncontrollably along the frozen channel. Impact disturbances were documented along the descent path, showing repeated collisions with protruding rock surfaces embedded within the couloir wall. The slide trajectory eventually carried her over the cliff band edge, initiating a free fall phase across a substantial vertical drop. During the fall, she struck multiple exposed rock outcrops along the mountain wall, which contributed to severe traumatic injury before reaching the lower slope zone. An automatic emergency beacon activated shortly afterward. Helicopter rescue was impossible due to sustained high winds and poor visibility. A ground search team reached the area the following day when conditions improved and traced the slide path over the edge. Rios's body was located at the base of the cliff using probing equipment. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be massive blunt force trauma from multiple fall impacts, with hypothermia and altitude-related impairment listed as contributing factors. The incident was officially recorded as a weather-related solo fatality on Everest's upper mountain. It was July 15, 2013, at Grand Teton Base Camp during an unusually warm summer. East-face routes showed instability from rapid morning warming and freeze-thaw cycles, prompting guides to warn of increased rockfall and postpone climbs until conditions stabilized. Cambria Fullerton, 35, was a corporate attorney from Jackson, Wyoming, whose career was built on persistence and asserting control in high-pressure situations. She approached mountaineering with the same mindset, viewing technical routes as challenges to negotiate rather than hazards to respect. Her climbing experience included non-technical peaks that required endurance, but she had no prior exposure to multi-pitch climbs or routes demanding rope systems and anchor placement. Fullerton's goal was to complete Exum Ridge in a single day to meet personal deadlines, framing guides as service providers whose recommendations could be challenged rather than safety authorities. By mid-morning, Fullerton had begun ascending the lower sections of Exum Ridge. The sun had warmed the east face, casting sharp shadows across jagged rock formations. Loose stones shifted under each footfall, and the thin mountain air carried the scent of heated rock and alpine vegetation. She moved deliberately along the exposed pitches, testing handholds and placing climbing protection, while remaining fully aware of the warnings about unstable terrain. The route demanded constant attention, but Fullerton's focus was split between rapid progression and documenting her climb for personal records. Despite multiple briefings warning of unstable rockfall zones and posted trail closures, Fullerton insisted on continuing. She repeatedly pressured her guide to maintain schedule objectives, dismissed route modifications, and advanced ahead of recommended safety pacing. During early morning exposure at the lower saddle, she ignored falling debris while documenting conditions, asserting that signed waivers and her own judgment justified her choices. Her guides cautioned that thermal expansion and loose rock made certain sections highly unstable, but Fullerton prioritized speed and completion over precaution. As Fullerton climbed higher along the Exum Ridge, the warming sun had already begun loosening small stones along the ridge's upper sections. The exposed metamorphic rock, fractured and jagged from previous freeze-thaw cycles, created a precarious environment where even minor thermal expansion could trigger large-scale rockfall. Fullerton moved quickly, placing protection as she ascended, but a dislodged boulder, roughly 25 pounds, plummeted from an overhanging ledge above her position. It struck her helmet directly, crushing the protective shell and transmitting extreme force through her skull. The impact caused immediate severe traumatic brain injury and cervical spine fractures, disrupting all voluntary nervous system function. The force of the strike broke Fullerton's grip on handholds, causing her to swing slightly before the climbing rope arrested her descent. She dangled precariously from her anchors, unable to support her own weight or regain control. Her body remained rigid from the combination of shock and injury, and loose debris continued to fall from above, striking the rope and surrounding rock surfaces. The sudden movement and vibration added further instability to the immediate area, forcing her guide to maintain tension on the belay line while assessing the situation from above, fully aware that any sudden motion could worsen the injury. Blood from cranial trauma began to soak through her clothing, and her breathing became irregular and shallow, indicating severe neurological compromise. Despite the guide's attempts to provide reassurance and prepare for technical rescue, Fullerton remained unresponsive, with agonal gasps marking the initial stages of brainstem failure. Hypothermia began to develop as she hung suspended in the thin alpine air, the combination of cold wind and metabolic shock compounding the effects of her injuries. Her guide immediately radioed rescue operations, but the narrow, steep terrain prevented immediate medical intervention. Technical ground teams required specialized rope and anchor systems to reach her position safely. By the time rescuers arrived several hours later, Fullerton was confirmed deceased from blunt force trauma sustained during the rockfall. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as severe traumatic brain injury with cervical spine fractures, noting that the incident resulted from natural objective hazards rather than equipment failure or guide negligence. Grand Teton National Park issued a formal report on the fatality, and guide services subsequently reinforced hazard acknowledgement protocols and emphasized that client timelines must yield to environmental safety, especially in thermal rockfall conditions. It was September 14th, 2018, during the post-monsoon climbing season on Mount Everest. The mountain was experiencing unusually dry conditions, creating deceptive weather that masked the serious hydration challenges facing climbers in the death zone. Guadi Escolastico, 46, a wellness entrepreneur from Beverly Hills, had built her brand around biohacking and optimizing human performance through unconventional methods. She promoted intermittent fasting, specialized hydration protocols, and metabolic efficiency training. Her Everest expedition was meant to prove her theories, documented for a planned Netflix series on extreme wellness. At extreme altitude, the human body loses water rapidly through heavy breathing and dry air. Climbers typically need 4 to 6 liters of fluid daily, along with 5,000 to 6,000 calories, just to keep their bodies functioning. Dehydration above 26,000 feet thickens the blood, reduces oxygen transport, and impairs cognition, compounding the dangers of altitude. Medical teams at base camp had stressed strict hydration and nutrition, warm liquids every 30 minutes, high-calorie foods every hour, and avoiding low-altitude strategies were essential. Escolastico dismissed these warnings, believing her own mountain optimization protocol could handle the stress. She practiced strategic dehydration to train her kidneys and intermittent fasting to improve fat-burning efficiency, ignoring her guide's advice. It was wild to think someone could be so confident in their methods that they ignored experts. I kept imagining how tempting it would be to feel smarter than everyone else, even when your life is on the line. From Camp 4, she immediately deviated from standard hydration practices. She drank little, claiming her body was adapted for efficiency. Warm tea and soup were declined because they didn't fit her self-imposed precision nutrition schedule. By morning near 27,000 feet, warning signs were clear. Her speech slurred, coordination faltered, and urine output dropped to almost nothing. She was showing early dehydration despite the cold. Seeing someone ignore these signs made it clear how easy it is to misread your own body. I pictured myself stumbling, thinking everything was fine, not realizing the danger. Her guide pressed her to drink, but she insisted her body was accessing stored hydration, and that stopping her protocol would hurt performance. As they climbed, her blood thickened, reducing oxygen flow to her brain and muscles. She stumbled frequently and showed confusion, but remained determined to follow her plan. By 28,000 feet, dehydration-induced altitude sickness became severe. Her heart raced, skin lost elasticity, and she experienced disorientation. She finally drank, but her body could not process fluids at that altitude, and the damage was irreversible. I couldn't help but feel scared seeing how stubborn decisions could pile up, one after another, pushing someone past the point of no return. During the final push to the summit, her severely dehydrated body gave out. She collapsed, unable to stay upright on the icy slope. Her guide quickly secured her with a safety rope and began emergency rehydration, giving small sips of electrolyte solution while monitoring her pulse and breathing. He radioed base camp for urgent evacuation, explaining her critical condition. Despite these efforts, her body continued to weaken. Her movements were sluggish, her skin pale and dry, and she became increasingly disoriented. The extreme altitude amplified the effects of dehydration, making the descent a struggle for both her and the guide. Even with help from team members, the prolonged lack of fluids had caused irreversible damage. She died at 28,400 feet from severe dehydration, acute mountain sickness, and cardiovascular failure. The coroner found her blood dangerously concentrated, essentially turning her circulatory system into sludge. Her water bottles were nearly full, proving she had deliberately avoided proper hydration. The incident was widely reported in wellness publications as a cautionary tale about applying unproven theories in extreme environments. Reading her story, it struck me how easy it is to trust ideas that feel good but aren't safe. I pictured myself in her shoes, seeing confidence turn into danger when basic survival rules are ignored. Her final social media post, published after her death, promoted listening to your body's wisdom, advice that could have saved her. Escolastico's story shows that at extreme altitude, proper hydration, oxygen, and nutrition are critical, and ignoring them can be fatal. It was May 20th, 2014, in the death zone above Camp 4 on Mount Everest. The South Col stretched flat and windswept at 26,000 feet, a barren expanse of rock and ice wedged between Everest and Lhotse. Felicia Holt, 44, ran a yoga and wellness studio and had hired a guide service for her second attempt at Everest after turning back the previous year due to weather. She had been practicing high-altitude breathing techniques for months and mentioned frequently that her cardiovascular conditioning would compensate for her limited technical climbing experience. During training rotations, she demonstrated pranayama breathing exercises to other climbers and explained how controlled breathing could reduce oxygen consumption at altitude. On May 19th, the expedition leader briefed the team on the summit window, a narrow 18-hour period of light winds starting at midnight, followed by an incoming storm. He emphasized a strict 11 a.m. turnaround regardless of summit status. Holt questioned why their cutoff was earlier than other expeditions and whether strong climbers could push past it. The leader repeated that all clients would descend at 11 a.m. without exception. That evening, Holt learned from climbers on other teams that 2 expeditions were targeting a 1 p.m. turnaround. She approached her guide to question why their timeline was more conservative. The guide explained that their group's oxygen supplies and client experience levels required the earlier schedule. Later, another team member mentioned that Holt had been asking whether the guides would actually enforce the turnaround if climbers were close to the summit. During the final equipment check at Camp 4, Holt asked whether 1 oxygen bottle would be sufficient if she used her breathing techniques to reduce consumption. The leader confirmed that 2 bottles were mandatory and not negotiable. Holt packed both, but told another climber she expected to use only 1. At 11:30 p.m., the team began the summit push. They reached the balcony at 4:20 a.m. and rested briefly. When supplemental oxygen use began, Holt activated 1 bottle at a reduced flow rate, intending to extend its duration. She left her second bottle cached at the balcony, telling her Sherpa she would retrieve it on the descent if needed. At 9:40 a.m., the team reached 28,700 feet on the final ridge approach. A line of approximately 30 climbers from multiple expeditions had formed on the fixed rope ahead, advancing roughly 50 feet every 10 minutes. The guide calculated their arrival time and determined the group could not reach the summit before 11 a.m. He instructed the group to descend. Holt unclipped from the fixed line and remained stationary. The guide repeated the instruction and gestured toward the descent route. When he touched her shoulder and pointed downward, she turned away and began moving upward along the edge of the fixed line, stepping around clipped-in climbers waiting their turn and disrupting the established order on the rope. The guide followed briefly, then stopped to radio for assistance and remained with the 3 other clients who agreed to descend. By 11:15 a.m., Holt had gained 80 feet and merged into traffic from 2 other expeditions. Her reduced flow rate had extended her bottle further than standard use, but by 10:45 a.m., it was empty. She continued upward using her breathing techniques, her pace slowing considerably. At 12:10 p.m., Holt reached the summit. She had climbed the final 130 feet without supplemental oxygen and stood at the top for approximately 3 minutes before beginning her descent. The traffic on the ridge had worsened in both directions. By 1:30 p.m., she was at 28,600 feet, moving slowly and no longer clipping and unclipping from the fixed rope correctly. At 2:05 p.m., she sat down on the narrow ridge. Her oxygen mask hung loosely over her face, connected to the empty bottle. She fumbled with her pack straps but could not manage the clips and did not respond to climbers passing, who asked if she needed help. At 2:20 p.m., she slumped sideways, her body held in place only by the Jumar still attached to the fixed line. 3 nearby climbers attempted to share oxygen using a spare regulator. Her breathing was already shallow and irregular. It stopped at 2:45 p.m. The incoming storm arrived that evening, and high winds the following day prevented any recovery above the south summit. Holt remained fixed to the rope at 28,600 feet, her second oxygen bottle still sitting at the balcony over 1,100 feet below. The investigation determined she died from acute hypoxia, compounded by exhaustion, concluding that caching her backup supply and refusing the turnaround had left her no margin for the traffic delays on the ridge. The report noted that controlled breathing techniques provide no meaningful protection against hypoxia in the death zone. She was not recovered until 6 weeks later. It was October 12th, 2017, on a rugged alpine traverse high on Mount Everest's northern mountain system. The day began with clear skies and light autumn wind along an exposed ridgeline above the established high camps. Within a few hours, weather conditions changed sharply, turning the routine traverse into a struggle against violent winds above the tree line. Tony Amiel was 41, a teacher from a northern city who had more than 15 years of hiking experience in mountain regions. He had completed several long alpine traverses before, and was known among companions for strong endurance and fast pacing. The intended route spanned a long, exposed corridor across multiple high-altitude peaks, with extended sections where natural shelter from wind and cold was absent. Amiel planned to complete the traverse within a single day, aiming to finish before the season's first major storm system reached the upper mountain. Weather advisories warned that wind speeds would increase during the day. Despite the warning, he began hiking, wearing light, movement-efficient clothing suited for rapid travel. Conditions worsened as he advanced along the ridgeline. Other climbers reported seeing him moving steadily across open mountain sections, while cloud cover thickened across surrounding peaks. Wind strength had already become sufficient to move loose gravel across bare rock surfaces, creating unstable footing for hikers carrying equipment. He sent a final communication stating that wind conditions were becoming more severe, but that he intended to continue. Afterward, he entered an exposed saddle section, consisting of wide granite slabs bordered by steep, unprotected drop zones. As the day progressed, wind gusts intensified to levels commonly associated with extreme alpine storm systems. Such wind speeds are capable of destabilizing a standing climber, particularly when moving across ice-slickened rock while carrying a backpack. The combination of wind pressure and uneven terrain caused repeated loss of balance. Witnesses later observed the climber being pushed off the marked path several times by strong sideways wind forces, requiring significant effort each time to regain footing before moving forward. Shortly afterward, a powerful wind surge swept across the ridge corridor. The granite surface had developed a thin layer of ice formed from moisture freezing under continuous cold airflow. The exposed slab section had no rope protection, vegetation, or nearby rock formations capable of reducing wind impact. The terrain provided very little friction, making stable movement increasingly difficult. The climber was eventually knocked to the ground by wind force. Search personnel later identified scrape marks and displaced gravel near the trail boundary, suggesting multiple attempts to stand while maintaining balance. An ice axe was recovered downslope with deep scoring on the blade edge, consistent with repeated contact against bare rock during attempts to slow a downward slide. The terrain near the drainage slope descends sharply into fractured granite walls and stacked rock ledges. Once momentum developed on the ice-covered stone surface, controlling downward movement became extremely difficult. The climber was carried toward the cliff boundary and fell a significant vertical distance down the rocky drainage zone, striking multiple protruding rock formations during the descent. Emergency response teams were notified immediately, but sustained high winds made helicopter access unsafe. Ground search teams waited until wind strength decreased later that night before beginning recovery operations. The approach to the ravine area required cautious movement across unstable mountain terrain. The climber was located several hundred feet below the trail in a rocky drainage valley. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be massive blunt force trauma from the fall, with hypothermia and prolonged environmental exposure as contributing factors. The incident was later used in mountain safety education programs to illustrate how rapid weather changes in high-altitude environments can transform ordinary traverses into life-threatening situations within a short time. On Everest's upper mountains, open ridges, extreme wind exposure, and ice formation can quickly eliminate safe movement margins. It was February 14, 2015, at Everest Base Camp. The North Col route faced pre-monsoon storm conditions, with gale-force winds and bitter cold. Snow whipped across the exposed ridges. Visibility was near zero, and prayer flags snapped violently against the white backdrop. At this altitude, even minor missteps could be fatal. Among the climbers preparing that morning was Brianna Hastings, 31, a Boston-based corporate compliance manager. She had no winter or high-altitude mountaineering experience and relied entirely on previous mild-season guided treks. Hastings approached the climb with a mindset shaped by control and dominance. She believed confidence and mental toughness could override the mountain's rules. Posted advisories and repeated warnings from guides emphasized that ascending alone in current conditions was life-threatening. Hastings ignored these cautions, insisting on proceeding without supplemental guidance, framing the expedition as proof she could master challenges others feared. As she moved above the upper camps, the climb became increasingly hazardous. Trail markers were obscured by fresh snow and wind, leaving her dependent on memory and limited GPS navigation. Spindrift, fine wind-blown snow, penetrated every layer of clothing, wetting insulation and reducing its effectiveness. Ice crystals formed on her gloves and face protection, impairing dexterity and making even simple movements, like adjusting backpack straps or holding trekking poles, difficult. Every step required careful placement on hidden rock or ice, but poor visibility made footing unreliable. By early afternoon, gusts approaching 90 miles per hour struck without warning, catching Hastings off balance on an exposed ridge. She stumbled into shallow depressions between boulders as trekking poles were ripped from her hands and her backpack waist belt tore under wind pressure, eliminating her main points of stability. Snow blew into her face, freezing against goggles and mask, and visibility dropped to near zero. Each successive gust drove her further along the slope, increasing contact with snow and ice, while wet clothing accelerated the loss of body heat. Hastings attempted to activate her GPS emergency beacon, but frost-numb fingers prevented proper operation. The device slipped from her grasp and became partially buried in snow. For the next 40 minutes, she crawled between rock outcrops and small ridges, seeking shelter from the full force of the wind. Hypothermia progressed rapidly. Uncontrollable shivering gave way to loss of fine motor control, confusion, and impaired decision-making. Attempts to call for help were incoherent, and she became increasingly disoriented regarding position and descent direction. Eventually, Hastings could no longer move, unable to maintain balance or recognize safe terrain. Breathing slowed and became shallow as hypothermia affected cardiovascular and neurological function. Consciousness faded while she attempted to use her phone, unaware that the device had no reception. Even minor movements like turning her head or shifting weight required immense effort. By the time rescuers reached her location the following morning, she was found unresponsive, partially shielded by boulders but fully exposed to the storm. Her climbing partner contacted base camp hours after she failed to check in. Extreme winds, steep terrain, and ongoing storm conditions initially made rescue impossible. Once teams reached her, The body was partially buried under wind-deposited snow. The medical examiner determined severe hypothermia as the cause of death, with exhaustion and dehydration as contributing factors. The GPS beacon was recovered nearby, but would not have enabled timely rescue under the conditions. The incident highlighted the extreme hazards of winter climbing on Everest. Exposure to sub-zero temperatures, high winds, and blowing snow can overwhelm even physically strong climbers. Confidence, social media goals, or prior fitness cannot replace preparation, adherence to guide instructions, or respect for the mountain's limits. In extreme conditions, rescue options are extremely limited, leaving little room for error. It was November 3rd, 2013, on the north face of Mount Everest during the late autumn season. Snow whipped across the mountain, cutting visibility to just a few feet. Only the most experienced teams remained as winter conditions began setting in. Leanda Berungela, 41, a fitness entrepreneur from Miami Beach, had built her career on high-intensity training and motivational content about pushing limits. She had summited several major peaks solo and prided herself on her independence. Everest was meant to be the culmination of her climbing career, proving that her mental toughness methodology could conquer any challenge. Above 26,000 feet, navigation depends on following established routes marked by fixed ropes and anchor points. Weather can change in seconds, turning a simple path into a deadly cliff. Guides rely on GPS, rope systems, and landmarks to keep climbers safe, especially in low visibility zones. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for me to get disoriented up there, even if I thought I knew the route. One wrong step in that whiteout could be fatal. Base camp had issued repeated warnings about the worsening weather and stressed the importance of staying in sight of assigned guides. Radio check-ins every 15 minutes were mandatory to ensure no one became separated from the group. Berunguela had clashed with her guide throughout the expedition, criticizing his slow pace and insisting her fitness and experience allowed her to move independently. Despite repeated warnings, she pressed ahead whenever possible, convinced she could navigate on her own. During the summit attempt, visibility dropped below 10 feet as blowing snow and thick clouds turned the mountain into a uniform wall of white. The team moved carefully, using fixed ropes and staying within sight of each other. But Berunguela grew frustrated with each pause, seeing safety measures as unnecessary delays. At a critical transition between two fixed-line sections, she chose to move ahead alone rather than wait for her guide to complete safety checks. I kept imagining myself in that situation, thinking I could handle it on my own, and how quickly confidence could turn into real danger. Confident in her memory and navigation skills, she ignored calls to halt and pressed forward. Within minutes, she lost sight of the team and the fixed ropes. Her radio calls grew increasingly urgent as she realized she could no longer identify landmarks or follow the established path. The extreme cold soon took a serious toll. Her GPS failed in the freezing temperatures, leaving her without a reliable way to navigate. She tried retracing her steps, but the endless white landscape offered no clear points of reference. Snow drifted over tracks, and the uniform terrain made it impossible to judge distance or direction. Her guide's radio calls went unanswered as she pressed forward, relying on failing memory and instinct. As hours passed, the weather worsened with strong winds and blowing snow, reducing visibility to near zero. Berunguela unknowingly entered a high-risk avalanche zone. Hypothermia drained her strength, and altitude sickness clouded her judgment. Her calls for help grew weaker, movement slowed, and the mountain's dangers closed in, turning the climb into a desperate struggle for survival. Search teams found her body 4 days later, nearly a mile off the main route. She had spent over 18 hours in the death zone, succumbing to exposure and exhaustion. Her equipment was scattered, showing she had tried to signal for help. I couldn't stop thinking about how one small mistake can get you completely turned around, and how being stubborn alone on the mountain can quickly become dangerous. The coroner confirmed death from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, with contributing factors including altitude sickness and dehydration. Her final coordinates showed she had been moving in circles, unable to find the main route. The incident underscored the importance of maintaining team cohesion in extreme conditions. Personal strength and determination could not replace teamwork and adherence to proven safety protocols. Fitness industry publications covered the tragedy, noting the fatal consequences of ignoring guidance in extreme environments. Following the incident, her motivational brand quietly disappeared from social media. The mountain had claimed another climber who believed personal excellence could substitute for collaboration, patience, and strict adherence to survival strategies. It was May 11, 2016, on the southern route of Mount Everest. The campsite consisted of dozens of tents arranged in clusters by expedition group, connected by paths stamped into the snow. Climbers moved between tents in the late afternoon, preparing gear and resting before the next rotation up the mountain. Jolene Harwood, 41, worked in real estate development and had paid for a guided expedition after completing a single mountaineering course in Colorado 6 months prior. She arrived in Nepal with climbing gear purchased online, including a harness system, carabiners, and ascending devices that cost roughly 40% less than equipment sold by the expedition outfitter. When other climbers asked about her gear during the trek to base camp, Harwood indicated she had done extensive research and found equivalent quality at better prices. During the mandatory gear inspection at base camp, the lead guide identified that Harwood's harness was a recreational sport climbing model designed for gym use and single-pitch routes. The belay loop was thinner than mountaineering standards, and the stitching was lighter weight than expedition-grade harnesses built for multi-week use under heavy loads. The guide recommended she purchase a replacement from the outfitter's supply for $280. Harwood refused, pointing to the UIAA safety certification on the label, and suggesting the guide was attempting to upsell unnecessary equipment. Over the following 2 weeks, Harwood's harness showed visible wear on the belay loop stitching. The fabric had begun to fray where it looped through the waist belt connection point. Another climber pointed this out at Camp 1, and a Sherpa raised the same concern on the climb to Camp 2. On both occasions, Harwood inspected the harness briefly and dismissed the concern, attributing it to normal abrasion and asserting she was capable of recognizing genuinely damaged equipment. She did not report the wear to the guides or request a replacement. On May 10th, the team moved to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet in preparation for the summit push. During the final equipment check, the expedition leader examined Harwood's harness and noted the fraying had progressed significantly, with multiple strands of the belay loop now visibly separated. He strongly recommended she use a backup harness from the emergency supply. Harwood declined, stating the harness had supported her weight throughout the expedition, and expressing unwillingness to switch to unfamiliar equipment at that stage. The summit team departed Camp 4 at 10:45 p.m. on May 10th. Harwood climbed in the middle of the group, clipping and unclipping from the fixed rope as the route zigzagged up the southeast ridge. The temperature was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds averaging 15 miles per hour. At 27,900 feet, the team reached the Hillary Step, a near-vertical 40-foot rock face requiring climbers to ascend using the fixed line and jamars. At 5:50 a.m., with the sky beginning to lighten, Harwood clipped her ascender to the rope and began the climb. She moved slowly, pulling herself upward in short bursts while other climbers waited below on the narrow ridge. Halfway up, at approximately 18 feet above the slope below, she stopped to rest and leaned back, transferring her full weight onto the harness. At 6:02 a.m., the belay loop separated from the waist belt with a sharp tearing sound. The stitching had ripped completely through the connection point. Harwood dropped backward, ascender still attached to the fixed rope, but no longer connected to her body. She tumbled past the waiting climber and fell down the exposed rock and ice face below. Her body came to rest approximately 200 feet below, on a steep snow slope angled at 55 degrees. Two guides descended from their positions and reached her location 30 minutes later. Harwood was face down in the snow, unresponsive, with no pulse or breathing. Her helmet had been knocked from her head during the fall and was located 40 feet upslope. The guides documented the scene and examined the separated harness, which remained clipped to the rope by the ascender. The belay loop had detached completely at the buckle junction, with thread bundles fully separated after weeks of repeated loading cycles. The investigation concluded that Harwood died from massive trauma sustained during the fall, including skull fractures, cervical spine damage, and severe internal injuries. The harness failure was attributed to using recreational-grade equipment for multi-week expedition climbing, a use category its UIAA certification did not cover. The visible fraying had progressed through the stitching layers until complete structural failure occurred under load. Harwood had been warned about the deteriorating equipment on 4 separate separate occasions and declined to replace it each time. Her body was recovered over 3 days before helicopter evacuation from 26,500 feet. The case was ruled an accidental death resulting from equipment failure after repeated refusal to replace visibly compromised gear. It was September 19, 2013, on the upper technical section of Mount Everest's southeast ridge. The morning was cold and still, with sunlight reflecting faintly off ice-covered rock. The route was technically demanding, with exposed terrain and unstable alpine conditions common at high altitude. Javier Cruz was 31, a rock climbing instructor from the western United States who had built a reputation for pursuing speed ascents on major mountains. Over several years, she had attempted rapid climbs across multiple alpine regions, emphasizing endurance and technical efficiency. Observers described her as highly skilled, but willing to push traditional safety margins in pursuit of record pacing. Her objective on Everest was to complete the upper technical ridge segment faster than the existing recorded speed attempt, prioritizing pace over extended acclimatization pauses. The route she chose crossed a steep section of mixed ice and rock terrain above the highest established camp zones. Although technically passable, the area required careful movement due to exposure to high winds and loose surface material. Expedition forecasts warned that afternoon thunderstorms were possible along the higher Himalayan ridges, a pattern occasionally observed during seasonal atmospheric instability. Bypass several recommended protection placements along the ridge. Instead of maintaining full rope security systems in exposed sections, she advanced using direct free climbing movement to reduce time spent stationary. By mid-morning, she had reached the upper headwall section, while remaining ahead of her projected schedule. At approximately 28,000 feet, Cruz began free soloing the final exposed wall segment leading toward the summit approach zone. During this period, cloud formations thickened across the western Himalayan horizon, and atmospheric electrical activity increased. The first lightning discharge was observed striking near the upper mountain shortly afterward. Despite visible storm development and rising electrical tension in the surrounding air, she continued climbing. Guides and nearby climbers later reported that descending to shelter was recommended, but she maintained upward movement to preserve record pace objectives. While reaching for a handhold near the middle section of the final headwall, a lightning strike struck the summit zone, releasing an electrical discharge that spread across moisture-coated granite and ice surfaces. The mountain rock, covered by thin layers of frozen condensation, allowed the current to travel along natural conductive paths on the cliff face. The sudden electrical shock caused Cruz to lose muscle control and grip strength, forcing her hand away from the rock hold. Immediately after losing her grip, she fell approximately 150 feet and struck a projecting granite ledge. The impact produced severe blunt force trauma and momentarily altered her fall trajectory, causing her body to rebound away from the ledge before continuing downward. She then entered a steep couloir filled with fractured ice, loose rock fragments, and irregular surface projections. During the uncontrolled descent, repeated collisions with rock and ice structures increased injury severity as momentum accelerated the fall along the narrow mountain channel. Climbers on nearby routes witnessed the lightning strike and fall and immediately relayed emergency alerts to base camp. However, ongoing electrical activity in the storm system prevented helicopter rescue due to high-altitude turbulence and lightning risk. Recovery teams reached the location after weather conditions stabilized several hours later. Cruz was found at the base of the couloir, about 450 feet below her last position. Medical examination confirmed massive blunt force trauma from repeated impacts during the fall, with burn patterns on equipment and hands consistent with electrical discharge exposure. Expedition records showed she was about 20 minutes ahead of the informal speed benchmark for that ridge segment. The incident later became a reference in mountaineering safety discussions, demonstrating how pursuit of speed records can increase exposure to environmental hazards. On Everest's upper ridges, thin air, sudden storms, and exposed terrain can quickly turn small timing decisions into fatal outcomes. And in the death zone, physical strength alone does not eliminate environmental risk. It was August 8, 2017, at Everest Base Camp during the late summer monsoon transition. The tent city remained active with acclimatization and route work, while recent snow and warming cycles had destabilized sections of the Khumbu Glacier, prompting warnings after near-miss ice incidents. Paisley Dalton was a graduate student specializing in human risk behavior in extreme environments. At 33, she approached Everest with academic confidence shaped by years of theoretical study, rather than practical exposure. Her research focused on decision-making under perceived danger, and she had frequently criticized expedition safety policies as overly conservative. Her field experience, however, was limited to controlled observation and short-duration high-altitude travel under supervision. Dalton's stated goal was to document climber behavior during non-peak conditions for thesis material. She viewed guide-imposed restrictions as obstacles to legitimate research rather than safeguards developed through prior fatalities. Despite being advised to remain within established movement windows and to avoid solo travel through unstable sections, she insisted that her academic credentials justified independent movement. She logged her intent to move ahead of her group, stating that her research objectives required autonomy. That morning, Dalton left base camp intent on advancing higher along the standard route through the Khumbu icefall. The climb required deliberate pacing across shifting ladders, crevasse crossings, and unstable ice blocks that constantly changed shape under temperature fluctuations. Other teams moved cautiously in fixed rope lines, spacing themselves carefully to reduce load stress on snow bridges. Dalton focused on documenting conditions and proving her independence in hazardous terrain, separated herself from the structured pace of surrounding climbers as she continued upward. As Dalton moved above the lower camps, conditions deteriorated quickly. Snow bridges across the glacier showed visible signs of weakening, and shifting cloud cover reduced visibility across the route. Guides advised holding position and rerouting around a section of icefall that had been flagged as unstable earlier in the day. Dalton ignored the recommendation and continued forward alone, choosing a shorter line that crossed the compromised area. She paused frequently to document surface features, extending the time spent in hazardous terrain. The glacier surface became increasingly uneven as she progressed. Subtle depressions and thinly covered ice concealed underlying voids, making safe foot placement difficult. Meltwater from recent warming cycles had weakened structural support beneath the snowpack. Without rope support or probing, she stepped onto a section that appeared solid but lacked load-bearing integrity. The snow collapsed beneath her without warning. Dalton fell into a concealed ice depression, striking hard ice during the descent. The impact caused multiple fractures and severe internal injuries. Loose ice and snow followed her into the cavity, further restricting movement and visibility. The confined space prevented self-extraction. Shock and blood loss rapidly limited her ability to move or call for assistance, while exposure to cold ice surfaces accelerated heat loss. Within minutes, her condition deteriorated to the point where coordinated movement was no longer possible. Dalton remained conscious briefly, attempting to call for assistance and stabilize herself, but blood loss and trauma progressed rapidly. Hypothermia compounded her condition as she remained immobilized on exposed ice. She lost consciousness before any assistance could reach her position. Her absence was reported hours later when she failed to check in. Rescue teams located her after conditions stabilized, but she was unresponsive upon arrival. Medical assessment confirmed death due to internal injuries and exposure sustained during the fall. The incident was recorded as a preventable fatality resulting from deviation from established safety protocols. Expedition leaders reinforced restrictions on independent movement and emphasized that academic expertise does not substitute for situational awareness or compliance with guide authority. The case was later referenced in mountaineering safety discussions as an example of how theoretical knowledge can fail catastrophically when it overrides real-world risk controls. It was April 15, 2015, on the slopes of Mount Everest. The morning sun stretched across the Khumbu icefall as climbers prepared to move higher, stepping carefully through shifting ice and narrow ladders. Even early in the day, the conditions felt unstable and every movement required focus. Mimosa Maktoum, 44, worked as a luxury real estate agent in Manhattan. Her climbing experience was limited to a few guided trips, but she approached Everest with strong confidence. After months of preparation and a costly expedition, she treated the climb as something she had earned rather than something she needed to adapt to. From early on, she focused heavily on documenting the journey, making it clear that reaching the summit with photos mattered to her. I noticed she treated the climb like a fixed goal, not something that could change based on conditions. As the team moved higher, guides emphasized the importance of reducing weight. At extreme altitude, even small increases in load can slow movement and increase risk. Sherpas carried carefully measured gear, balancing what was needed for survival with what they could physically manage. Every item had a purpose, and anything extra could become a problem later. Mimosa pushed back against those limits. She insisted her Sherpa carry additional personal items, including camera equipment, extra clothing, and non-essential supplies. The added weight went beyond what was recommended. When concerns were raised, she dismissed them and continued with her plan. That stood out to me. It wasn't just extra gear, it was an extra strain on someone already working at their limit. On summit push day, the team left Camp 4 in the early hours, entering the death zone where oxygen levels are critically low. At first, progress was steady, but it didn't take long for the added weight to slow things down. Her Sherpa began falling behind, breathing harder and struggling to keep pace. Other team members offered to redistribute the load, but she refused. She wanted everything kept with her, and the climb continued at a slower pace because of it. By early morning, it was clear they were behind schedule. At that altitude, timing matters. Weather windows are short, and delays increase exposure to risk. As they continued upward, winds began to pick up, and visibility started to drop. I could tell this was where things shifted. The delay wasn't just slowing them down anymore, it was putting them into worsening conditions. As they approached higher sections, the weather deteriorated quickly. Winds strengthened, and temperatures dropped sharply. Other teams began turning back. Mimosa's team was still exposed, still climbing, and now dealing with fatigue and worsening weather. Her Sherpa eventually reached a point where he could not continue. The added load and altitude had taken too much out of him, and he collapsed on the route. At that moment, the expedition leader called for an immediate descent. Mimosa resisted. She argued she had come too far to turn back. The discussion took time, and in that environment, even a few minutes matter. By the time she agreed to descend, the storm had fully arrived. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the team struggled to move safely. Temperatures fell to extreme levels, and every step became harder. They were forced to stop on a narrow section of the mountain, exposed to wind and cold, with no proper shelter. This was where everything caught up at once. The delay, the added weight, and the worsening weather left them with little chance to recover. They remained exposed through the night, using up oxygen and energy while trying to stay alive. Without shelter and with limited supplies, their bodies began to shut down under the stress of altitude and cold. By morning, Mimosa could no longer continue. She had become too weak to move, and the effects of exposure had taken over. At some point during the night or early morning, she lost her footing and fell from the narrow ledge where they had stopped. Rescue teams later found her body about 200 feet below. The cause of death was ruled as severe hypothermia and exhaustion, with contributing altitude effects. The prolonged exposure, combined with earlier delays, left her body unable to recover. From how it played out, it felt preventable. The warnings about weight and timing were clear, but they were ignored in favor of personal priorities. It was April 23, 2013, at Everest Base Camp in Nepal. Climbers moved between expedition camps in the late morning, some preparing for rotations while others rested after descending. The Khumbu icefall loomed above, a chaotic maze of ice blocks and crevasses marking the route to Camp 1. Rosalind Fletcher, 43, worked as a corporate attorney and had signed up for a commercial Everest expedition after completing several weekend hiking trips in Colorado. On her application, she listed experience on 3 peaks above 14,000 feet and described herself as an experienced alpine hiker with basic technical skills suitable for guided expeditions. During the initial team meeting, the expedition leader reviewed each climber's background. When asked specific questions about crampons, ice axes, and fixed rope systems, Fletcher gave general answers suggesting familiarity without concrete examples. The leader noted her responses but did not press further, as all clients would undergo skills training during acclimatization. On the first rotation to Camp 1, Fletcher struggled with the ladder crossings over crevasses in the Khumbu icefall. She required multiple attempts to clip and unclip her safety tethers at each junction and moved significantly slower than the rest of the group. Her crampon points caught on the ladder rungs twice, causing her to freeze mid-crossing. When the guide asked about her mountaineering course, Fletcher said it had covered the basics and she just needed practice. During the second rotation to Camp 2, her technique remained poor. She frequently attached her ascender backwards or failed to properly lock the cam, requiring repeated correction from guides. Her crampon work on steep ice showed poor front-pointing form, causing excessive arm fatigue. The expedition leader recommended additional practice before the next rotation. Fletcher insisted she was improving and would be ready for the summit push, mentioning the significant money and time away from her law practice she had invested. On May 15th, the expedition moved to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet for the final acclimatization rotation. The route climbed the Lhotse face, a steep ice wall requiring continuous rope work and front point technique on slopes averaging 50 to 60 degrees. Fletcher departed Camp 2 at 6 a.m. with the group. Within a few hours, she had fallen 100 feet behind, her inefficient technique requiring excessive effort with each step. By mid-morning, she had stopped twice on small ledges to rest. Her pace slowed to roughly 50 feet every 15 minutes. At 12:30 p.m., at 23,400 feet, Fletcher began coughing. The fits continued and worsened with exertion. The guide radioed the expedition leader and recommended immediate descent to Camp 2. Fletcher refused, stating she had invested too much time and money to turn back during a training rotation. She stood and continued climbing. By 2:15 p.m., her coughing had intensified dramatically, stopping her every few steps. Pink-tinged frothy sputum appeared at the corners of her mouth. The guide recognized this as high-altitude pulmonary edema and radioed an emergency. Within minutes, Fletcher was unable to stand without support, her breathing wet and gurgling. The guide clipped a short tether from his harness to hers and began lowering her down the fixed line. At 2:40 p.m., Fletcher lost consciousness. The guide continued the descent for 30 minutes, making minimal progress against her dead weight on the steep face. Two Sherpas ascending from Camp 2 reached them at 3:10 p.m. The three worked together to move Fletcher down the Lhotse face, alternating between lowering her on the rope and short roping across less steep sections. At 4:20 p.m., at 22,400 feet, one Sherpa checked for a pulse and found none. Her lips and face had turned bluish. They continued moving her body down to Camp 2, arriving at 6:50 p.m. exhausted. A guide with wilderness medical training confirmed she had died from pulmonary edema. The investigation reviewed Fletcher's performance records and contacted the mountaineering school listed on her application. The school confirmed she had completed only a weekend introductory course, not a comprehensive technical program. Her Colorado climbs were verified as standard hiking trails, requiring no ropes or crampons. Medical analysis concluded her poor technique forced her body to work 2 to 3 times harder than a skilled climber on the same terrain, triggering acute pulmonary edema. Her refusal to descend when symptoms first appeared at 12:30 p.m. eliminated the window when descent might have reversed the condition.